Imagine the open North Sea, a biting salty wind, and a wooden drakkar cutting through the icy waves. Most people today sincerely believe that the Vikings set out on their legendary sea voyages relying solely on brute strength and cold water. We were taught in school that these rugged, bearded warriors loaded barrels of fresh water on board and bravely endured the hardships of long weeks at sea. But here is where it gets interesting, because the real story of survival looks completely different and is far more technical. If the crew of a warship really had drunk only raw water on long voyages, they simply would not have physically made it to the shores of England. The ocean does not forgive naive mistakes, and northern sailors 1,000 years ago understood microbiology better than you might think. Loading the ship with fresh water from the nearest river seems like the most obvious and logical solution. Today, we take convenient plastic bottles with us on the road and don't even think about the fact that water can go bad. But here's the thing, 1,000 years ago, ordinary water in a sealed container turned into a biological weapon in just a couple of weeks. Inside dark, damp wooden barrels, bacteria multiplied instantly, and the clear liquid became covered in thick green slime. Drinking such a substance on the open sea meant signing your own death warrant from dysentery long before encountering an enemy army. The Vikings drank at sea what a modern person would call a rather strange travel cocktail. Their main source of hydration was alcohol of varying strengths and special fermented products. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Sending a crew of people who regularly consume intoxicating beverages out into a storm seems the height of recklessness by modern standards. But for the northern peoples, this was not a matter of fun or bad habits, but a strict system of survival. They turned the process of quenching thirst into a complex chemical defense mechanism for the body. Modern scientists could hardly believe the sheer volume of strange liquids these people carried with them. When archaeologists began studying the logistics of sea voyages, they were astonished by how much space provisions took up on the ship. The drakkar was not just a fast warship, but a brilliantly designed floating warehouse where every centimeter mattered. And a huge portion of that limited space was reserved for oak barrels filled with anything but spring water. A modern logistics expert, looking at this cargo, would likely conclude that the Vikings were heading to a massive festival, not to war. But let's set aside the Hollywood myths about drunken savages swinging axes without any control. Iron discipline reigned on board the ship, and alcohol consumption was controlled just as strictly as the distribution of ammunition in modern special forces. No one was allowed to drink themselves into a stupor, because the lives of the entire crew depended on every rower's reaction. The beverages they carried were specially brewed to provide energy and kill germs, not to cloud the mind. It was a calculated engineering approach to nutrition in extreme conditions. In essence, they invented sports energy drinks 1,000 years before the advent of laboratories. To grasp the scale of this system, you need to imagine the actual living conditions on the open deck. Drakkars had no cozy cabins, heaters, or comfortable kitchens for preparing hot meals. People were out in the open air around the clock, exposed to freezing rain, salty spray, and biting winds. My joints start to ache just at the thought of spending even a couple of cold nights like that. Under such conditions, the body required a colossal amount of calories simply to maintain internal heat. And plain water was completely inadequate for this task, being a mere empty shell in terms of energy value. Instead, Northerners used liquids that simultaneously nourished the muscles and warmed the blood. They intuitively understood the concept that modern nutritionists call calorie density. Why fill your stomach with empty water when you can drink a liquid that works like liquid bread? This saved space for solid provisions, which were always in critically short supply on long expeditions. Every sip was a mathematically precise dose of carbohydrates necessary for hard physical labor. This survival strategy was not born of a life of ease, but through a process of brutal trial and error. Those crews that tried to rely on conventional water sources simply vanished into the cold waters of the Atlantic. Only those who adopted the art of fermentation and learned to preserve liquids for months on end survived. The evolution of seafaring forced the Vikings to become outstanding practical chemists of their time. They didn't know the word bacteria, but they knew perfectly well that boiling and fermentation save lives better than any spells. And here's what's truly remarkable. Their methods were incredibly effective, even by the standards of modern science. Today, researchers studying the gut microbiome confirm that fermented foods radically boost immunity. The Vikings created the ideal diet for strengthening the body, without microscopes or medical degrees. They simply observed nature and applied what yielded the best results in combat conditions. Modern sports medicine is only now beginning to recommend practices that were part of a Norwegian rower's daily routine. In this scenario, we'll take a detailed look at exactly what was sloshing around in those heavy oak barrels aboard the Drakkars. We'll find out why their methods would first make modern doctors clutch their heads in disbelief, and then give them a standing ovation. You'll learn how ancient seafarers solved the problem of dehydration using technologies that seem absurd today. Get ready to forget everything you knew about Viking expeditions from popular TV shows, because the real story of logistics and survival on the open sea is far cooler than any fictional saga. The problem of fresh water on ships remained sailors' worst nightmare right up until the 19th century. Water is an incredibly capricious substance, especially if you're trying to store it without modern refrigerators. As soon as you pour river or lake water into a wooden container, a biological war invisible to the eye begins. Microorganisms, algae, and bacteria find the perfect dark, damp environment for rapid reproduction. In just 2 weeks, this life-giving source turns into a putrid sludge that reeks of swamps and death. Imagine you're in the middle of the ocean. The sun is beating down mercilessly, and your mouth is parched to the point of bleeding cracks. You open the lid of your cherished barrel, hoping for a life-saving sip, but the foul stench knocks you off your feet. A modern person, upon seeing such a scene, would immediately run to call the health inspector. For sailors of the past, this meant an agonizing choice: die from severe dehydration or risk dying from dysentery. Most chose the risk, and this led to the destruction of entire fleets long before any battles began. Disease claimed tens of times more lives than even the sharpest enemy swords and arrows. The Vikings were among the first in maritime history to recognize this deadly mathematical law. They understood that relying on luck to provide the crew with water was the fate of suicides. The wood used to make the barrels served as an excellent breeding ground for microbes. Even if a barrel was thoroughly charred on the inside, micro cracks still became a refuge for harmful flora. A fundamentally different solution was needed, one capable of guaranteeing the safety of the liquid throughout months of travel. And they found that solution by turning to the oldest human invention: controlled fermentation. The fermentation process produces alcohol, which is itself an excellent natural preservative. But it wasn't just about the alcohol, because to make the drink, water was first boiled for a long time with various herbs. Without realizing it, ancient brewers were performing mass sterilization, destroying all dangerous microorganisms. Modern science confirms that boiling is the basic and most reliable way to make water safe. Add to this the antibacterial properties of hops and other wild plants, which were generously tossed into the brew. The result was a kind of chemical shield that prevented new infections from developing inside the barrel during the voyage. The drink might have soured or changed flavor, but it remained biologically safe for the hardy sailor's stomach. It was a brilliant survival hack that allowed the Northerners to expand the boundaries of their world from America to Byzantium. While other peoples huddled close to the shores for fear of running out of water, the Vikings boldly ventured out into the open ocean. But things get even more interesting when we look at the logistics of loading such a ship. An average warship carried about 40 rugged men, each of whom needed a huge amount of liquid. During strenuous physical work at the oars, a person loses up to a liter of sweat per hour. This means that for every day of the voyage, the crew required hundreds of liters of drink just to maintain muscle function. This is no typo. For a month-long raid, a drakkar had to carry a veritable sea of liquids on board. How could such volumes be accommodated on a narrow ship with no hold in the sense we're used to? The Vikings utilized the space beneath the deck planks, stacking the barrels in a specific way along the keel. This solved two critically important engineering challenges at once to ensure the ship's seaworthiness. First, the heavy barrels of drink served as ideal ballast, making the lightweight drakkar incredibly stable on the waves. Second, the cold ocean water washing over the hull acted as a giant natural refrigerator. The temperature of the liquids remained consistently low, which further slowed down any spoilage processes. That is why engineering and survival always went hand in hand during the era of Scandinavian expansion. The ship was not merely a means of transportation, but a complex organism where every detail served multiple functions. Barrels of drink provided weight, quenched the crew's thirst, and sometimes even served as temporary seats for the rowers. Your modern office job requires a college degree, certifications, and years of experience in comfortable conditions. But these guys built integrated survival systems using an axe, wood, and incredible ingenuity. Imagine the stress levels of a captain who realizes that everything depends on the safety of these barrels. If a storm damages the barrels and the liquid leaks out, the entire expedition will be doomed to a painful death. That is precisely why the profession of the cooper, the master barrel maker, was so highly valued in northern societies. The cooper made wooden containers without a single nail, using only precisely fitted planks and metal hoops. Sounds like a boring craft, right? Not true. These guys were actually the aerospace engineers of their time, creating life support systems. A cooper's mistake cost far more than a blacksmith's slip-up when forging an ordinary iron sword. A broken sword meant the death of a single warrior in fair combat. A leaky barrel meant the slow and inglorious demise of an entire crew in the midst of a merciless sea. That is why barrels were made with maniacal precision, with every seam and joint checked for airtightness. The Vikings entrusted their lives not only to Odin, but also to the impeccable quality of a well-crafted oak container. The main beverage that flowed in rivers during expeditions was not hard liquor at all, but light ale. This is not the modern craft beer from a trendy bar that you drink on Fridays. The Viking ship's ale was cloudy, thick, and contained only about 2 to 3% alcohol. Its purpose was not to intoxicate the crew, but to safely quench their thirst. With that alcohol content, you'd have to drink an entire barrel to lose the ability to row effectively. But why did ale become the staple of the northern seafarers' diet for centuries? The answer lies in the surprising nutritional value of this cloudy, sediment-filled beverage. During the brewing process, the grain released a massive amount of slow-release carbohydrates and B vitamins into the water. It was essentially liquid bread that could be easily swallowed without wasting time on prolonged chewing. In the midst of rocking waves and storms, drinking is much easier and faster than trying to swallow a piece of dry flatbread. The body received an instant dose of the energy needed to maintain physical activity and body heat. Modern athletes pay a fortune for carbohydrate gels that provide energy during marathons. The Vikings simply took barrels of mead with them and achieved the exact same physiological effect. Slow-release carbohydrates kept blood sugar levels stable throughout long hours of grueling rowing. You can't row with a heavy oar for 6 hours straight on an empty stomach or on water alone. Muscles need a constant fuel supply, and weak ale fulfilled this role flawlessly. It is important to understand that the production of this liquid fuel was an incredibly large-scale and serious process. Brewing ale before a major military campaign turned into a full-fledged industrial operation for the entire village. Tons of grain were ground by hand, and huge vats bubbled day and night, spreading a thick Swedish aroma. The women, who traditionally oversaw this process, were the chief chemists and technologists of Northern society. Whether the drink would turn sour in a week or withstand a month-long raid depended on their skill and the precision of their proportions. The water used for brewing was taken from the purest springs, but even that was not considered safe without fire. It was boiled longer than the recipe required, intuitively undergoing deep thermal sterilization. The yeast added to the wort created a competitive environment where dangerous bacteria simply could not survive. This is a surprisingly elegant biological solution to the problem, which humanity devised without any microscopes. Modern microbiology only confirms the genius of these forgotten folk methods of food preservation. They turned water into a safe energy source using fire, grain, and invisible fungi. But here's what truly amazes modern physiologists studying the diets of ancient warriors. Viking ale contained traces of yeast, which served as a powerful source of probiotics for the gut. Amid the appalling, unsanitary conditions of military campaigns, a strong immune system was the only defense against mass epidemics. Daily consumption of this beverage gave sailors rock-solid resistance to infections and poisoning. Today, people buy expensive pills at pharmacies to restore their gut flora after stress. The rugged northern men simply drank their ship's ale and remained healthy even in the filthiest conditions. Of course, the taste of this drink was very different from what we're used to today. They often added yarrow, bog myrtle, or even tree bark for bitterness and preservation. Hops became popular later, so early batches of ale had a very distinct herbal aroma. It sounds more like a dubious herbal tea from a folk healer than a drink for fearsome conquerors. But that bitterness acted as an additional antiseptic, killing any germs that dared to enter the barrel. Imagine the distribution system for this liquid gold on board in the midst of a grueling voyage. The issuance of ale was strictly rationed by the captain or a specific person in charge of supplies. There were no merry drinking binges with songs, as Hollywood movies so love to portray. Ale was dispensed in portions precisely calculated to sustain strength, like medicine prescribed by a doctor. Violating this rule or stealing the drink was punished with extreme severity, even to the point of being thrown overboard. If supplies were running low, the captain faced a difficult tactical choice. He had to either urgently seek shore to replenish water and brew new ale, or turn back. Often, raid routes were planned specifically with the availability of clean rivers and grain supplies in mind. The logistics of liquids dictated the military strategy of an entire civilization, determining the extent of their expansion. War always relies on supply lines, and for the Vikings, this line was measured in barrels of beer. They could not venture further than their supplies of safe, liquid, high-calorie fuel would allow. So, when you hear about the incredible endurance of Scandinavian warriors, keep this fact in mind. They were not magical superhumans immune to fatigue or the chill of ocean winds. They were pragmatic strategists who fueled their bodies with the right high-octane fuel. Their victories were forged not only in the smithies where swords were made, but also in the vats where ale was brewed. Proper hydration and carb loading won battles long before armies met on the field. But ale was far from the only, or even the most surprising drink in the Norse arsenal. The true secret weapon of long expeditions was a substance known as blenda or skyr. Essentially, it was sour whey, heavily diluted with water, left over from cheese production. To modern people, drinking old sour whey seems like some kind of sophisticated culinary punishment. But the Vikings valued this murky liquid almost as much as fresh beer or water. Why was this strange liquid so important for survival in harsh maritime conditions? The answer, again, lies in a brilliant understanding of human physiology and the principles of food preservation. The acidic environment of the whey naturally suppressed the growth of any pathogenic bacteria inside the container. Unlike water or weak ale, blenda could be stored in wooden barrels for many months. Not only did it not spoil, but over time it became even more rich and tangy. It was the ideal drink for transatlantic voyages when land was out of sight for weeks. But even more important was the unique biochemical composition of this ancient dairy product. Whey contains a huge amount of electrolytes, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, which are essential for muscles. During strenuous rowing, a sailor loses not only water but also these vital salts through sweat. If they replenish these losses with plain water alone, severe muscle cramps and cardiac arrest would set in. Modern coaches call this hyponatremia and make athletes drink sports drinks. The Vikings simply poured a mug of whey and kept rowing like well-oiled machines. In essence, they created the perfect sports energy drink 1,000 years before science. It was ancient Gatorade, only it tasted like a harsh salad dressing. Lactic acid aided digestion, and the salts instantly restored the strength of tired arms. When a hand holding an oar began to tremble treacherously from fatigue, a sip of blenda worked wonders. The electrolytes restored neuromuscular connection, and the warrior could continue working at the same pace. The production of blenda was closely linked to the advanced livestock farming of the Scandinavian peoples. Cows and sheep's milk were processed on a massive scale into cheese to stock up on protein for the winter. The remaining whey was never poured out, as this was considered a terrible waste of valuable resources. It was carefully collected, fermented, and diluted with water in strict proportions before being loaded onto ships. Waste-free production in the Viking Age was a matter of survival for entire settlements. Sometimes the blend was mixed with other ingredients to boost its nutritional value. Crushed berries or herbs might be added, creating a veritable vitamin bomb against scurvy. Scurvy was the bane of sailors until the 18th century, when they learned to take lemons on voyages. But the Vikings suffered from it much less frequently thanks to their strange fermented concoctions. Vitamin C was perfectly preserved in the acidic environment of the whey throughout the long journey. Again, they didn't know about vitamins, but they clearly saw the connection between diet and gum health. They stored this precious liquid in huge oak barrels that were thoroughly saturated with acid. The smell on the ship was, to put it mildly, distinctive, a mix of sweat, resin, and sour milk. If a modern person were to step onto a dracker, they would pass out from the scent alone. But for the rugged northerners, it was the scent of reliability, home, and guaranteed survival on the expedition. As long as the barrels were full of this caustic liquid, the crew knew they had a chance of reaching their destination. I wonder how priorities were balanced between ale and blenda during a long raid. Ale, being tastier and a quicker energy booster, was usually drunk in the first few weeks of the journey. It provided the initial momentum and helped the crew get into the grueling rhythm of rowing. But the blenda remained an untouchable reserve, true liquid gold for the absolute worst-case scenario. They opened it when the shores had long since disappeared from view and the beer supplies had turned into empty barrels. Imagine the psychological effect of this sour liquid in the midst of a violent storm. Waves are flooding the deck, people are working at the limit of their strength, and the cold penetrates to the very bone. At that moment, a sip of the acrid, salt-saturated whey acts like an electric shock. It restores mental clarity and relieves spasms in the back and arm muscles seized by cramps. The ship's survival depended on whether the men could keep bailing water and holding the oars, and this ancient isotonic drink did the job better than any prayers to the harsh Norse gods. So the next time you drink a sports drink after a workout at the gym, think of the Vikings. Your bright little bottle with its chemical raspberry flavor does exactly the same thing for your muscles. The only difference is that afterward, you'll head for a warm shower instead of boarding an English ship. Ancient seafarers discovered the secret of electrolyte balance through pain, sweat, and generations of daring experiments. They turned the byproducts of cheese making into fuel to build one of the greatest empires of the past. Now let's put all these facts together and look at the ship's logistics from a purely numerical perspective. Planning an expedition was an extremely complex mathematical process that tolerated no miscalculations whatsoever. The Drakkar captain wasn't just a tough guy with an axe, but a true crisis manager. He had to calculate the weight of the crew, weapons, loot, and most importantly, liquid provisions. Overload the ship with barrels, and you'd lose speed and maneuverability in the event of a surprise attack. Take too little, and the crew would die of dehydration or exhaustion halfway to their destination. A standard Drakkar, about 20 meters long, carried roughly 30 to 40 hardy rowers. Under conditions of heavy physical labor, each person required at least 3 liters of fluid per day. This means the ship had to carry over 100 liters of beverages on board every day. A 1-month expedition required more than 3 tons of ale and sour whey. This is a massive weight that critically affected the draft and handling characteristics of a wooden vessel. Modern cargo calculations use complex computer programs to distribute weight. The Vikings did this by eye, relying on years of experience and an intuitive understanding of the physics of water. Barrels were stacked in a strict order, forming the lower tier of the ship's ballast system. As the liquid was consumed, the ship's weight changed rapidly, altering its behavior on the waves. The captain had to constantly redistribute the cargo and crew to prevent the Drakkar from capsizing in a storm. It was a constant balancing act between life, death, and the laws of harsh aerodynamics. And here, another factor comes into play: the metabolic rate of trained warriors. During intense rowing, the body burns between 5,000 and 7,000 calories a day. Feeding such a crowd solid food like dried meat or fish was incredibly difficult. Dry food requires additional liquid for digestion, exacerbating the problem of dehydration. That is precisely why liquid calories from murky ale and whey were an absolute lifesaver. They solved 2 problems at once. They nourished exhausted muscles and prevented dehydration. When the stomach refused to accept tough, salty meat, a sip of ale went down easily and quickly. The body didn't waste precious energy on heavy digestion, channeling all resources directly into the muscles. It sounds like the concept of ideal sports nutrition, developed in a state-of-the-art laboratory. But it was born in the cold fjords by people who simply wanted to survive at any cost. To maintain this pace of consumption, discipline around the drinking barrels was truly ironclad. No one could simply walk up and scoop out some ale whenever they suddenly felt like a drink. Water and beverages were distributed strictly on schedule, under the watchful eye of the captain's trusted officers. This prevented both petty theft and the dangerous squandering of strategic supplies. At sea, Every sip counted, and overspending could easily cost you your head. Justice on the ship was measured not by democracy, but by equal shares of bitter fuel in a mug. What happened if the calculations proved incorrect or a storm prolonged the voyage? A regime of extreme economy began when rations were cut to the absolute minimum. People began to weaken, the ship's speed plummeted, and the risk of mutiny soared. In such situations, it was the antibacterial properties of fermented beverages that saved the remaining crew. A body weakened by hunger would easily catch any infection from contaminated water. But blenda and sour ale remained safe even in the most desperate and filthy conditions. They provided crumbs of energy, enough to make rare but synchronized strokes. Documentary sagas describe instances when drakkars landed on shores with a half-dead crew. The men were physically unable to stand, but they survived thanks to these ancient isotonic drinks. Their bodies were exhausted to the limit, but their digestive systems remained healthy, allowing them to recover quickly once ashore. This survival math defined the entire nature of Viking expansion in the early Middle Ages. They could strike where they were least expected, crossing vast bodies of water. European kings could not understand how entire armies appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the ocean. The secret lay in flawless fluid logistics and a knowledge of the chemistry of fermented foods. Their invincibility was built on wooden barrels filled with sour milk and cloudy beer. Innovations in nutrition allowed them to turn the impassable ocean into a high-speed highway for their raids. This is a stunning example of how adaptation to a harsh environment gives rise to ingenious technologies. The Vikings did not record their survival recipes in thick academic treatises or textbooks. They passed this knowledge down through tradition, craftsmanship, and the harsh practice of sea voyages. Their science was inscribed not in books, but in the construction of oak barrels and the formula for ship's ale. And this applied science proved so powerful that it redrew the political map of the entire world. In popular culture, the image of the Viking is inextricably linked to a huge horn filled to the brim with sweet mead. Movies and TV shows persistently show us bearded giants drinking this nectar day and night. It seems as though they went into battle completely drunk on thick, strong mead. But the real history of logistics shatters this beautiful cinematic myth to smithereens. Mead did indeed exist, but its status and use were radically different from our imaginings. Honey in the northern lands was an incredibly rare, expensive, and strategically important commodity. Obtaining it in the cold climate of Scandinavia was a task requiring colossal effort and luck. The production of mead took a long time and required a huge amount of this precious raw material. Therefore, using it as an everyday drink to quench the sailor's thirst would have been madness. It would be like filling a tractor's fuel tank with vintage French champagne instead of diesel today. The economics of such an enterprise would have collapsed before the ship even left its home fjord. Mead was an elite alcohol, a drink of kings, jarls, and great victors. On board the ship, it was present in very limited quantities, hidden in the captain's personal chests. It was saved for special occasions, the conclusion of important alliances, or the celebration of a truly great victory. A sip of mead was a symbol of high status and a reward for exceptional bravery in battle. It was a ritual drink, connecting people with the gods, not a remedy for mundane dehydration while rowing. Sometimes small portions of mead were used for purely medical purposes to save the gravely wounded. Honey itself is a powerful natural antibiotic, known since ancient times. The thick, sweet, alcoholic beverage made from it provided an instant burst of energy to a weakened person. Roman physicians, incidentally, also treated wounds with a mixture of honey and wine, recognizing its healing properties. It sounds like a strange cocktail for a bar, but on the battlefield, it was a genuine life-saving concoction. When a warrior was bleeding out after a brutal skirmish, a mug of strong mead acted as shock therapy. The alcohol slightly dulled the unbearable pain, while the fast-acting sugars triggered survival mechanisms in the brain. This allowed the wounded to be carried back to shore alive, preventing them from dying of pain shock or exhaustion. Modern emergency doctors use intravenous glucose for similar purposes. The Vikings didn't have IV drips, so they poured glucose straight down the throat along with the booze. Brutal, primitive, but in extreme conditions, it saved lives like a charm. In addition, mead played a huge role in maintaining the crew's morale before an inevitable battle. Imagine a foggy morning, the coast of England rapidly approaching, and a wall of shields awaiting you ahead. Fear is a natural reaction of any normal person to imminent and very likely death. A ritual cup of mead, passed around in a circle, symbolically united the crew into a single brotherhood before Odin. It didn't make them drunk, but it removed a psychological barrier, allowing them to act calmly and decisively. Therefore, when archaeologists find luxurious drinking horns in the graves of noble warriors, one must understand the context. These are not everyday vessels for quenching thirst on a dirty and wet sea voyage. These were ceremonial objects of pride, testifying to the wealth and high status of their owner. In reality, sailors drank their sour ale from simple wooden or leather mugs. Luxury was always the preserve of the few, while the survival of the majority depended on simple and reliable items. And at sea, this class distinction in beverages was particularly clear and uncompromising. The myth of constant feasting on ships undermines our understanding of the Vikings' true mastery. It turns brilliant navigators and engineers into caricatures of drunken revelers in horned helmets. In reality, their discipline surpassed that of many regular armies of the time. They planned their raids with cold calculation, not under the influence of sweet alcoholic intoxication. The success of the Scandinavian expansion was the result of strict planning, not chaotic drunken aggression. Mead was their celebration, while sour skyr and cloudy ale were their hard daily work. To earn the right to drink mead from a silver horn in their jarl's warm longhouse, they first had to survive on sour whey in the midst of the raging North Sea. This contrast between harsh daily life and vibrant rituals shaped a unique northern character. One can only truly appreciate the sweetness of victory when one has tasted the bitterness of salty seawater and exhaustion. Studying their logistics strips away the cinematic gloss, but makes the story far more profound. We see not mythical heroes, but real people struggling to survive at the limits of human endurance. Their knowledge of fermentation chemistry and nutrition boggles the imagination of the modern researcher. They use the limited resources of the North with maximum efficiency, turning disadvantages into advantages. And it was precisely this deep understanding of the laws of nature, not some mythical mead, that made them masters of the oceans. They simply knew how to make microbes work for their fleet. Summing up this historical investigation, we can draw several paradoxical but undeniable conclusions. The Viking Age's oceanic expansion would have been physically impossible without a deep understanding of microbiology. They didn't know terms like electrolytes, pasteurization, or complex carbohydrates, but their methods of preserving liquids worked in strict accordance with modern scientific principles. Fermentation became their major technological breakthrough, no less important than the design of the drakkars themselves. Without sour ale and whey, their perfect ships would have remained to rot along their native shores. The story of the Vikings' survival at sea is a triumph of practical intelligence over a harsh environment. Replacing rotting fresh water with safe, low alcohol and fermented milk drinks was a brilliant solution. This allowed them not only to avoid dying of dysentery, but also to maintain tremendous physical fitness. They turned the problem of hydration into a system of continuous energy supply for their muscles. The modern sports nutrition industry has simply repackaged these ancient principles into attractive plastic containers. The logistics of liquid provisions dictated the rules of warfare in the early Middle Ages. A captain calculating the balance of ale barrels was no less of a strategist than a general on the battlefield. A miscalculation meant a slow death from exhaustion and thirst amidst the indifferent salty waves. Cooperage masters, who crafted perfect oak barrels without nails, were engineers of life support systems. Their craftsmanship ensured that the precious liquid would reach the shores of England safe and sound. The myth of the Vikings as wild drunkards crumbles when confronted with historical facts. Their consumption of alcohol on voyages was a strictly functional, calculated, and tightly controlled process. Ale and mead were not a means of merriment, but bitter fuel for the ceaseless work of rowing. Real feasts with mead remained the privilege of kings on shore, not the reality of dirty sailors' daily lives. The strictest discipline reigned at sea, where every sip was a mathematically calculated dose of survival. And any rebellion against these rules was punished by the harsh judgment of the ocean. The women brewers who oversaw the brewing of ship's ale deserve a special place in history. It was they, remaining on shore, who forged the success of their husbands' and sons' future military campaigns. Their knowledge of grain proportions, water boiling, and the use of bacteria saved thousands of lives. They were the unseen architects of Scandinavian victories, creating antibacterial shields within wooden barrels. Without their arduous and precise chemical labor, not a single drakkar could have crossed the Atlantic. This forces us to look at the level of development of ancient civilizations as a whole in a completely different light. What we arrogantly consider primitive habits today often turns out to be the result of deep adaptation. People of the past were not stupider than us. They simply solved problems using the materials available to them. And often, their natural, intuitive solutions proved far more reliable than our modern artificial technologies. They lived in harmony with the harsh laws of biology, because breaking those laws meant instant death. The next time you see a Viking ship in a movie, don't just look at the swords. Take a closer look at the heavy wooden barrels stacked at the bottom of that sleek, deadly vessel. Remember that what's sloshing around inside isn't clear spring water, but a murky, sour mixture of survival. Realize what an incredible journey this liquid took to become the fuel for the Northern Fury. And imagine the taste of this ancient isotonic drink, sour, bitter, yet offering hope for life. It changes the perspective of how we perceive an entire historical era, making it tangible and frighteningly real. Studying history through seemingly mundane details like drinking water opens up whole new worlds. We stop seeing abstract dates and the movements of armies on flat geographical maps from textbooks. We begin to feel the calluses on the rowers' hands, the cold of the wind, and the sour sting in our mouths. Real history is not just about kings and great battles chronicled in annals. It is humanity's struggle against nature for every sip, for every day, for the right to simply exist. I hope this journey into the world of ancient logistics and microbiology has left you in awe. We often underestimate our ancestors, relying on the comforts of our modern, plastic, sterile civilization. But the knowledge that the northern peoples acquired through blood and sweat deserves our sincere respect. They proved that human intellect and the will to live can overcome any obstacle, no matter how terrifying. The ocean tried to kill them with thirst and bacteria, but they learned to use those bacteria to their advantage. And with that, Our story about liquid fuel in the Viking Age has reached its logical conclusion. Let us know in the comments. Would you dare to try real ship's blend after a good workout at the gym? Don't forget to support the channel, because history still holds so many hidden, crazy, and brilliant survival secrets. We'll continue to unravel the mechanisms of the past, proving that ancient people were far smarter than we're used to thinking. Stay curious, appreciate the comforts of modern life, and remember that the one who still has strength at sunset is the one who wins. Until we meet again in our historical investigation of the mysteries of the past.